Money laundering. What is it? We hear about it all the time. It's on the news practically every night. You open up a newspaper story, you read about some infamous criminal being indicted for money laundering. We all assume we have an understanding of what constitutes money laundering. But the more I talk to people about money laundering, the more I realize people really don't understand it. The victim in money laundering is always the government. Money laundering means that you are concealing the source of income either for purposes of tax evasion or for purposes of concealing criminal behavior. So let's go back to what money laundering means on a very basic level. I always like to start off with the mafia crime family types. And when you look at a criminal enterprise, they're making money selling drugs, they're making money through prostitution, they're making money through whatever extortion, bribery, whatever kind of criminal activity that they're engaged in. But nowadays it's usually drugs of some sort. They're collecting cash on the street corners or wherever they're selling their goods. That cash goes into a closet or a briefcase. A good example of someone who needed money laundering was Walter White in Breaking Bad. If you saw that series, you saw that he had a storage locker that was filled with money, with currency. So why didn't he just go out and spend it all? Well, there's only so much money that you can spend buying dinner at restaurants and buying groceries and otherwise tipping people at your favorite health club or wherever it is that you tip people. Well, one can ask, why don't they just take that to a bank? And why don't they just deposit the money in a bank? Well, you can't deposit that much cash in a bank. There are currency transaction reports that every bank is required to file whenever someone deposits $10,000 or more in cash. And those reports also need to be filled out by businesses that may deal in large amounts of cash, like jewelers or car dealers. It's very hard to use that cash to buy much of anything. Use cash for normal purposes, but if you're a drug dealer and you're a successful drug dealer, you can't use millions and millions of dollars in cash every month. Well, Walter's solution was to buy a car wash. So why did he buy a car wash? Because car washes are businesses where customers generally transact in cash, or it's not uncommon for customers to transact in cash. Other businesses that make good vehicles for money laundering are restaurants, any kind of vending machine type business like a laundromat, an arcade of any type. And so you see oftentimes criminal elements taking over industries of this nature. One industry that has been often used as a money laundering vehicle is the garbage industry. For some reason, garbage has been one of those businesses that has often used cash as its means of payment. Up until recent times, the garbage industry was heavily influenced by cash transactions, and so it was a good vehicle for money laundering. Of course, what's the best vehicle for money laundering? It's a casino. Everybody uses cash at casinos, and for that reason, casinos are so heavily regulated. And all of the procedures that are set up at casinos are designed to prevent the ability to launder money through a casino. That's why the mob invented Vegas, because if you could have a domestic city where you had casinos that were lawful, you could launder untold amounts of cash through those casinos. When you launder money through a restaurant or through a garbage business or through a arcade company or a casino, what happens then? Well, you take the money from those drug transactions and you convert it into profits from that business. Rather than reporting the money to the IRS as criminal proceeds, you report it as profits from the restaurant. Again, going back to the Breaking Bad episode where Saul Goodman is explaining to Jesse Pinkman the need to launder the money through a nail salon. The idea is that you don't want to get arrested for tax evasion. And you go back to the days of Al Capone. That's what Al Capone was put away on. It was put away for not paying taxes on his criminal proceeds. Yes, you need to conceal the money, but then you also need to pay taxes on it. And if you don't pay taxes on it, you're going to get as much jail time as you would for the substantive offense. So you got to figure out some way to pay taxes on it. And the best way to do that is to launder it through a legitimate business, a cash-rich business, and make it appear as though your illegitimate income is legitimate business profit from your restaurant or from your casino or from whatever other business that you may have. That's the stereotypical money laundering case. You take over a business and then a cash-rich business, and you use that cash-rich business to intermingle your illegitimate profits with your legitimate profits, if there are legitimate profits. And the government, the FBI, you'll see in some movies where FBI agents are staked out in front of some miscellaneous business. The two agents are sitting in their car and they're literally counting people going in and out of this establishment. The reason that they do that is because they can see the amount of income that's being reported or the amount of deposits that that business is making every day with the bank. And if they go out in front of the restaurant and they see that only 2 people enter the restaurant every day, and those 2 people are employees of the restaurant, and nobody else enters the restaurant that day, they know that that restaurant is not making $10,000 a day. Again, in the Breaking Bad episodes where Skyler was so concerned about how much money she could launder through the car wash in any given day, that's what she was getting at, is that you couldn't launder millions and millions of dollars through the car wash every month, because that would raise the suspicion of the IRS, because the IRS could simply station agents in front of the car wash, count the customers coming in and going out, apply the average car wash price to the number of customers that were going in and out, and see whether the deposits by the car wash were matching up with the actual business that was being done. So she had to be very careful to make sure that they weren't intermingling too much illegitimate money with the legitimate money of the car wash. So that's sort of the basic form of money laundering. To conceal from the government that this income that you're receiving is illegitimate income. Obviously, you would want to use as much cash as you could just to support yourself, but even that will tip off the government to a degree, because essentially any transaction that you make these days through a bank account can be monitored by the government, and certainly if the government has a suspicion that you're involved in criminal activity, they will begin to monitor your bank accounts. And if they don't see normal spending activity like expenses for groceries and expenses for haircuts and clothing and daycare and all of these other things, these normal expenses that all of us have, and they simply see basically you're not using a bank account, or the amount of money you're using out of your bank account is far less than necessary to support your lifestyle, that's going to create the inference that you are perhaps engaged in some sort of illegal activity that the government should investigate further. That's especially the case in modern times when it's virtually become a cashless economy. So in addition to hiding the fact that you're engaged in criminal activity and that criminal activity is creating illegitimate proceeds, that's one form of money laundering. The other form of money laundering is basically tax evasion. Obviously, if you are a drug dealer and you are making a lot of money and you have the ability to move cash out of the country, you would take advantage of that ability, because if you don't have to pay taxes on the money, you wouldn't. So that's why oftentimes when you hear in the news that the Coast Guard intercepted a vessel or a plane, chances are 50-50 that the vessel is going to be filled with drugs or cash. The drugs come in from South America on a boat, and they unload the drugs, and then they load the cash, and then they take the cash offshore to accounts in the Cayman Islands, or Switzerland was always a popular place for criminals to deposit their criminal proceeds, because both of those countries have bank secrecy laws that essentially prevent governments like the US and essentially disable law enforcement from investigating or even knowing about the source of the monies deposited in those banks. Now, of course, this doesn't do a lot of good if you're not someone who leaves the United States very often, because as soon as you pull the money out of your foreign bank account and brought it back into the US, that's again going to raise red flags for the government. Very difficult to bring that money back into the United States and to use it without getting taxed. But if you have the ability to get the money out of the country, and you have the ability to travel abroad and spend the money when you're not here in the US, then that can be an effective means of money laundering. And it can also be an effective means of tax evasion. That's basically the two types of money laundering that you have going on. One thing about Breaking Bad that didn't make much sense was that Walter White had all of his share of the profits coming back into the United States, especially when he was dealing with the Czechoslovakian drug ring. If you recall the dark-haired woman that Walter killed by putting poison in her stevia, she was always bringing cash back from Czechoslovakia. On a practical criminal level, that didn't make a lot of sense. I mean, if the money was already outside of the country, why bring it back into the country and then launder it through the car wash? The criminal would simply keep the money overseas, and especially a person in Walter White's position, where his whole plan was to be in the business only for a brief period of time, and then he was going to get out of it or he was going to die. But in any event, it was clear that when Walter White was done, he would not need to have $30 million in the United States. And so he or his family would have the ability to pick up and move to a foreign country, whether it's Switzerland or Argentina or wherever you wanted to move to, have your pick. You just couldn't live in the United States. So those are some of the issues about money laundering. It's not the type of activity that injures private people. It injures the government. It disables the government from collecting taxes. It disables the government from identifying criminals. And so a lot of times when people in civil lawsuits talk about money laundering, what they really are talking about is embezzlement, or they're talking about fraud of some sort, where the proceeds of some type of unlawful activity like breach of contract or fraudulent conveyances or what have you are manipulated by the defendants, and through the manipulation it causes injury to the plaintiff. That's not really money laundering. Money laundering is tax evasion, or its mechanisms designed to disguise the illegitimacy of cash that's earned through criminal transactions. So with today's law lesson, I'm Jeff Grell.